Hello and welcome to today's webinar. It's called Improving Literacy for English Language Learners, and it's sponsored by Imagine Learning. My name is Marianne Zaire. I report on English Language Learners for Education Week. And just before we get started, let me give you a heads up about a couple of technical items. The webinar is interactive, so you can ask questions at any time. You just type a question into where it says Ask a Question, and we'll try to answer these at the end of the presentations. Also, the webinar is going to be available with the PowerPoint presentations 24 hours after we finish today. You'll be able to get that at our website, which is www.edweek.org. We have two experts here today on English language learners as guests. Diane August, a senior research scientist at the Center for Applied Linguistics, will give us an overview of principles that guide effective literacy instruction for English language learners. Also with us today is Gabriela Uro. She's the manager of ELL policy and research for the Washington-based Council of the Great City Schools. She'll talk about how school districts can make English language learners an integral part of literacy plans that are carried out by the district. So one question I'm hoping that we'll have a chance to address today is how can implementation of the state Common Core standards provide a chance for school districts to give this group of students better access to the core curriculum in schools. So now I'm going to turn it over to Diane.
Okay, thanks very much, Marianne. As Marianne said, my name is Diane August, and I'm a senior research scientist at the Center for Applied Linguistics, and I am going to talk about principles for effective English literacy instruction for English language learners. And the talk I'm giving comes from a chapter that I wrote for the California State Department of Education. And I need to acknowledge my co-editor and co-writer, Timothy Shanahan, and also need to acknowledge the people who participated in the National Literacy Panel on Language Minority Youth, because this chapter builds on that work. So in terms of the role of research in doing a sort of understanding literacy development and being effective in teaching literacy to second language learners, I think we don't really need to talk much about the statistics showing the challenge facing English language learners. One statistic that's fairly recent and quite interesting, though, is data from the ECLS-K sample, the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study K sample. It's longitudinal data that followed a sample of U.S. children from kindergarten through, the data I'm reporting on is through 5th grade. And what's interesting is if you look at three groups of learners, so language minority children who enter kindergarten with English proficiency, language minority learners that enter kindergarten who are English proficient, and native English speakers, you see that there are virtually no differences in development for those language minority children who enter proficient in English. However, for children who enter school as not English proficient, if you compare them to native English speakers, you see in kindergarten there's about 0.6 of a standard deviation difference between the kids, which is about 2 years. Standard deviation amounts to about 0.3 of a standard deviation amounts to about 1 year's worth of growth. But by the end of 5th grade, this difference between English language learners and English proficient kids is 0.8 of a standard deviation. We're talking about reading on standardized measures here. So that's about 2.5 years difference in reading development. And what's interesting, again, is if you match the children by socioeconomic status, there's still a difference at the end of 5th grade between English learners and native English speakers, but it's more like 0.4 of a standard deviation. So I think that's fairly interesting. We know teachers really are doing the best they can to meet the needs of English language learners, and I think our best chance of improving literacy outcomes for these children is to rely on previously successful approaches and to look at the research to determine what has been effective, and that's what I'm going to report on now, but basically focusing on the principles. In terms of the nature of the evidence I'm using for this talk, we started with findings from the National Literacy Panel for Language Minority Children and Youth, which provided a comprehensive review of the research evidence. We've updated that review through 2009, and we're going to summarize those subset of studies that are experimental in nature. Now, this should not imply that I don't really value qualitative research. I do work reports on qualitative studies, but for the purposes of this talk, I'm looking just at those experimental studies. So if you look, the first principle really is that effective instruction for English language learners emphasizes the key literacy components. And this is very similar to findings about research-based practices for native English speakers. And if you look at across those components of literacy, you see that English learners benefit from explicit instruction in phonological awareness and decoding. Those N's refer to the number of experimental studies we located between 1980 and 2009. You'll notice there's still not many, more than the report that we presented that was published in 2006, which actually looked at studies through 2002. Anyway, and the G's are effect sizes. So an effect size of 48 is a moderate effect sizes that are about 2.2 to 0.3 are small effects, and anything above 0.8 is a large effect. So you can see here that there are a growing number of studies that are revealing the kinds of instructional practices that make a difference in teaching these aspects of literacy to ELs, and let's find out a little bit more about what they tell us. So we do find that effective instruction for English learners builds on what works with native speakers. It's a really good place to start, and in fact, this is what a lot of the researchers do. They take practices that have been effective for native English speakers, and they try them out with English language learners. So in many cases, the same commercial programs are used, or the same instructional approaches or procedures. And so what do we find out about these procedures that sort of are similar to what we know about effective practice with native speakers, besides what I've just said about sort of explicit instruction in these different components, is decoding instruction delivered in small groups was an effective method, vocabulary instruction that teaches individual words, word learning strategies, immerses children in rich and varied language experiences, and develops word consciousness, effective with native speakers, also effective with English learners. Comprehension instruction that engages students in making meaning. So with both native speakers and English learners, it's important to make sure the kids fully understand the text they're reading. So this means that we need more than just strategy instruction here, because by ensuring children really process the text, we're building their background knowledge, which then enables them to actually comprehend what they're reading. Writing instruction that provides modeling, practice, teacher feedback, and editing. And then if you look at the What Works Clearinghouse, there's some of the studies on English learners are listed there. But as I say, while researchers start with what we know about effective practice for native speakers, they make adjustments to this instruction. And a big problem with the research is that the researchers are not very explicit about how they've made modifications or adjustments to these instructional routines, and they tend not to do studies where they take a group of ELs and half the ELs get the standard approach for native speakers with no modifications, and the other half get the modified approach. So there are very few studies that do this, and we really need more research in this area. But if we look at the kinds of adjustments that have been made, one major adjustment really has to do with the strategic use of the first language. So right now, remember, I'm really focused on those studies that really use mostly English to develop English literacy. This isn't to say that native language instruction is not effective. In fact, it's very effective, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'm focusing on English instruction. However, even when children are instructed mostly in English, it's quite important to use, and you can use, if you're able, their first language. So some examples here, a really nice study by Teresa Roberts, which was just published, where she had Spanish-speaking children and Hmong children in her sample. They were young children, and parents read stories to their children in the children's native language, which wasn't English, or English, and then children in school heard these stories in English, and she measured vocabulary performance. And what she found was that the children who heard the stories first in their native language and then in English did better than the children that just heard the stories in English. In a study with elementary school children, I tried to pick samples from kids at different levels, and children that were able to hear have the story previewed first, or the material previewed first in their own language and then presented in English and reviewed in English, did better than kids that just heard the story only in English. And then a really nice study that looked at reciprocal teaching, where the children were Chinese speakers in middle grade. These children actually were in Taiwan. The teacher provided reciprocal teaching, questioning, summarizing, clarifying, predicting, practice first in the children's first language and then in English, where the strategy instruction was in the same language as the practice. And although this study was not a randomized controlled trial, you did see statistically significant increases in comprehension on researcher-developed and standardized measures of comprehension. So another adjustment really has to do with really making adjustments for differences in children's knowledge. And, when we're working with second language learners, they can draw upon a lot of knowledge and skills that first language learners may not yet have. For example, decoding abilities, their conceptual knowledge, sort of understanding about how to apply strategies. And so if you look at a series of studies, for example, one study, so sometimes this actually is helpful and sometimes it tends to interfere. So in one case, for example, in study by Kramer, the researchers provided auditory discrimination training to help first through third graders who are Spanish speakers hear the difference between minimally contrasting word pairs. So, for example, B and B, sounds that they would not tend to hear in their first language. Vocabulary instruction that helps students draw on first language knowledge. In a study I was involved in which Maria Carla was the first author, we did a lot of work helping children understand what cognates were and apply their Spanish cognate knowledge to understanding the meaning of English words. And this whole area of really helping kids be literate in their first language and teach them about cognates is really important, because a half to a third of all words in English, for example, are cognates with Spanish. So it gets a little more complicated, but because it requires children to have this knowledge in their first language, but it's a really good strategy to use. And finally, reading and writing programs that take into consideration first language reading and writing skills. So there's a very nice study by Bill Saunders. It was a transition program, and a key principle for this program was to develop language arts instruction that really made explicit connections between students' existing knowledge, skills, and experiences and academic curriculum that they had to learn in English. Okay, I'm going to try to move along here. I'm going to give you just a few quick examples of, some of the materials. I really don't have much time for this, but I hate not to do this. So with young children, we do this simple activity where we show them the English word, ask them to define it, show them a Spanish word that's a cognate, ask them to define it and talk about which of these words have meanings that are the same and not the same. So this word pie and PA, they're false cognates because they have different meanings in English and Spanish. This is an activity that we do with older students who are learning science. There are a lot of technical words that are the same in English and Spanish. After the kids learn about cognates, they work with a partner and read this text to try to identify the words that are cognates. Here you see the words that are listed, and children have to find the letters that are different in the words, or rate, in this next slide, rate the words that are how close they are in the way they sound, because cognates differ. They differ slightly in terms of meaning, but also in their orthographic and phonological representations. Okay, so in terms of other important differences that need to be taken into account in trying to do a good job of instructing these children is giving the children more time to complete the lessons. If you look, for example, as well as actually giving them more time overall to develop oral proficiency and content area knowledge in English, which if I have time I'll talk about briefly later on. Instruction in small groups so teachers can better target instruction. If you look at those phonics and phonology studies, 7 of those studies actually worked with the children in small groups so that they could really target instruction on the specific levels of the children, and a lot more scaffolding. So what do I mean by scaffolding? This is really the short version here, but using visuals and gestures, clarifying difficult words and passages through instructional conversations. So you're in mixed classrooms teaching children. These children have various levels of literacy proficiency as well as oral language proficiency. I work in middle grade classrooms in Texas, and I can tell you in those classrooms, 1/3 to 2/3 of the children are not reading on grade level. So a way to make passages clear is really to read them aloud to children, inserting lots of questions into the read alouds for discussion to make sure children are processing small chunks of text at a time. Additional modeling, so really having the teacher provide examples before requiring the student to do so, and additional review. So this is just an example of how we might teach vocabulary. We provide a visual. This happens to be 7th grade science, where we try to pre-teach some vocabulary, but in a way that enables students to sort of process the meaning of this word without having deep knowledge of it. So we define the word. We do a thumbs up, thumbs down in this instance, see if the kids know the word. We explain how the picture demonstrates the word before we provide a definition. We provide a definition in Spanish, which is helpful to teachers. And then we do an activity at the end that we do as partner talk to really engage the children in thinking about the word. Again, this is some interactive reading that we've developed where you can see there's a very small chunk of text that's read, and then there's a lot of questions that are asked about this text to make sure that the children are really understanding what's happening. And here is an example of a concept map that is, again, it's a visual that ties concepts together, specific vocabulary words that cross-cut different parts of the lesson, and this really talks about plants and animals and how they obtain energy. So this is very helpful after the children have done a lot of hands-on activities here. So I want to just, I'm going to need to wrap this up very quickly, but just briefly, this instruction has to be comprehensive and multidimensional. We need a sufficient amount of time, so they need more time to master the same content, but they also need more time overall. If you look at really good research done by Hakuta and colleagues, it really takes children 3 to 5 years to acquire language proficiency in English and 4 to 7 years to acquire academic language. They need a complete curriculum. So while I'm talking about literacy, we also have to really give them access, and I think Gabriela is going to talk about this, to grade-appropriate content. There's a lot of emphasis these days on skills instruction, but we really need to couple skills with making sure students understand what it is they're reading. children acquire another language through interacting with their peers in English, and we need to provide opportunities for this and parent involvement. And I'm going to skip this slide because I've pretty much talked about it. The last important point I'd really like to make is the importance of developing oral language proficiency in the context of developing literacy or content area knowledge in children. And I presented data before that just showed the differences in language minority children who are English, limited in English versus native English speakers. It's really important for us to develop these kids' oral language proficiency. Methods to do this, just briefly, is make sure in content area instruction we focus on both language and content objectives, and again, to group ELs with English proficient students to provide meaningful opportunities for interaction in English. Other important factors: differentiating instruction, making sure teachers are well prepared to meet the needs of ELs, and a lot of ELs are integrated into content area classrooms. We need to ensure these content area teachers are well prepared to teach ELs in their classroom, and again, to make sure our instruction is respectful of the home language. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diane. We're now going to break for a message from the webinar sponsor, Imagine Learning.
Help your English learners improve their literacy and make bigger gains. Give them Imagine Learning English, a software program with more than 2,500 engaging activities, first language support in 13 languages, differentiated instruction, and continual assessment. Proven effective for English learners, struggling readers, students with disabilities, and early childhood education students, Imagine Learning English is your language and literacy software solution. Learn more by visiting imaginelearning.com/ELL today.
Now we turn to Gabriela Uro. She's from the Council of the Great City Schools, and she will talk about how school district administrators should consider, what they should consider in improving literacy for English language learners. She's going to focus partly on the context that many school district administrators are thinking of right now, and that is implementation of the state's Common Core academic standards and what they should consider for English language learners.
Thank you, Mary Ann. And first I want to just thank you and Education Week as well as the sponsors for holding this webinar on two very important topics related to ELs. And after hearing Diane's presentation, it sort of validates the feeling I already get that I know from our own districts that are struggling with finding effective approaches for improving literacy for ELs. It is so multidimensional and involves so many moving parts that it really is no wonder that some of the districts are having some hard times with bringing it all together. But what we're now facing is the prospect of implementing Common Core that actually incorporates an even higher demand in terms of the command of English language. So in addition to already having a current situation that we might consider is not problematic, but it is challenging, now we're actually having to face even a greater challenge. Before I go into the details, I want to just share some background with regard to the Council, because I'm not sure if all the listeners are aware of the Council of Great City Schools and our work. We are a member organization, and we are in D.C., but we represent urban school districts across the nation, 65 of the nation's largest. And this is like places like New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, Dallas, and several others. Our 65 school districts represent less than half a percent of the total school districts in the nation, but we actually enroll close to 16% of the nation's children. And the point that I think is germane, especially for this webinar and for the work that I do, is that in our 65 school districts, we actually have 30% of the nation's ELLs. So for us, it is critical that if we need to make the Common Core work for our districts, and if we're able to make it work for the ELs in our districts, I think that will bode well for ELLs across the nation. So we're very much concerned about getting it right. In terms of the Common Core, we've been very focused for years now in improving student achievement in our districts. We were actually the first organization and the only one that signed up initially for the National Voluntary Test back in the days of President Clinton. And so we stayed on the course of truly pushing for higher standards for all students. And I'm sorry, I forgot to push the next button. Here's a slide just giving you some details regarding the total enrollment. We're actually at 8 million students at this point. That was for 2007, 2008. I'm sorry, 2008, 2009. I wanted to briefly just list for the presentation, I'm hoping to answer Marianne's question that she posed. Will the Common Core state standards, really push school districts to provide better access for ELs to the core curriculum? And in my mind, I think, is it an opportunity or a menace for greater access for ELs? And we are banking on it being an opportunity. It's a challenging one, but we are banking on it being an opportunity for a variety of reasons that I'd be happy to go into. For one, I think it is clear that it's shifting the instruction, and that is not only for English learners, but for all students. And that's another point that I want to cover. Then I will go into the current challenges at a more systemic level that pose difficulties for doing the type of work that Diane described that is critical. There are a number of organizational challenges, if you will, and then other contextual ones that we find in our districts when we go out to look at their programs, that they're not able to move the needle enough to really make a difference for EL sometimes. And then I'll just briefly touch on the implementation work around Common Core that we are doing with our school districts, but mostly to ensure that it's not an afterthought, that it's more systemic, and that EL issues are integrated into that work. So let me go into why I think it really is an opportunity for improved access. I think, for one, during the development of the standards, I know there was a discussion in the field as to whether or not there was a need to develop a parallel set of standards related to the English language proficiency. And there was a lot of discussion around that, but it seems that at the end of the day, the consensus was around not creating separate set of standards for ELs, but rather having the Common Core standards really address ELLs as well, and have it be an expectation for all students, whether it be English language learners or even students with disabilities. I think it was helpful for us, considering how many ELLs we have in our districts, and just being urban districts in general. For us, it was important to have a level field of expectations, and not have it differentiated at the level of expectations, but rather at the level of instruction and implementation. And I think that's where the hope and the opportunity lies. The challenge, I think, is going to be one where how do you actually get the implementation of the strategies to really work in concert with general ed and all the movement that's taking place in the districts. The shift in instruction is a piece that I was mentioning, and I will briefly go into that. In terms of shift in instruction, today about 80% of the English language arts curriculum is based on literature, and the Common Core standards actually calls for 50% to be based on reading from informational text. And I think this is critical for ELs, because having the work be based on what is in front of them, the informational text, will actually allow students to perform and feel they can perform better, rather than having to rely on funds of knowledge or cultural background that they don't really have. And the child might actually have rich and deep knowledge of their own cultural background, but in terms of reading from literature, the child then is at a disadvantage, because there are numerous cultural funds of knowledge that are germane to the U.S. culture. And for many of our English language learners, to the extent that they haven't developed those yet, my sense is that they're going to have a better chance, if instructed properly, to really excel and do well with deriving meaning from informational text. And this applies also in secondary. It is a challenging issue in secondary, because there the breakdown is a third based on scientific text, a third on informational literary nonfiction, and a third on literary. But again, I really think that to the extent we're able to provide instruction for English language learners based on content, they will have a better time of grasping that knowledge, but also of acquiring English language proficiency. In terms of writing, it is going to be also a shift in instruction for all students and all teachers. But for English language learners, that poses an additional challenge because, as we know, that's where we're talking about producing language, and it will be a challenge. It just requires a deeper knowledge from teachers with regard to second language acquisition. I don't have a lot of time, so I don't want to get into this too much, but I do want to mention these are two domains of the standards that we actually conducted a survey among our district member staff to get a sense of what were their thoughts with regard to the implications for English language learners of the particular standards. And what we found is that a number of the initial folks that we surveyed were bilingual education staff from central office as well as teachers at the school level. And we gathered information from about 700 staff overall. And their reactions were pretty consistent. And the comments were around needing a little bit more clarification, need for examples, and just the shift in instruction. And again, the deeper content knowledge as well as PD for teachers. With regard to language specifically, there were concerns about standards that rely on production of language. And as we know for English language learners, that is a stage that is later in the language acquisition stage. And to the extent that a standard is measuring content or the mastery of a specific standard, we have to be very clear that it's not measuring erroneously language proficiency. And that's where a number of staff mentioned the need to have very clear examples of even what the standard and the response to the standard looks like at varying levels of proficiency in English. So quickly, I want to talk about some of the challenges with regard to improving literacy in our districts. And this is drawing from the work that we have been doing for over 10 years, where we go into districts with a team of practitioners from our member districts to help districts look at their programs in instruction or operations. But we've done this, we've done around 50 on the instructional side, including special education and English language learner programs. What we find is, again, that the challenge of improving literacy, and much of it has to do, and I want to go back to one of the things that Diane mentioned about programs that sometimes don't take that additional step of adjusting and making adjustments and incorporating the oral proficiency development for students. And they take, the 5 prime areas of reading and they focus on skills, but then for English language learners, they fail to incorporate whether it be English language development, explicit instruction around that, but also the whole notion of meaning and comprehension. Systemic issues are something that we raised in our study, Succeeding with English Language Learners. And again, this is where we find that for many of our districts, the process around supporting general education in a given school district, involving even from determining the district's philosophy and pedagogy around literacy, the adoption of related instructional materials and professional development, the adoption of particular intervention programs and supports if they're involved in, Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 type of programs. Those are systemic processes that many times the English Language Learner Office, whatever it might be called in a particular district, is not an integral part of. They might be an afterthought. They might be brought in to then make adjustments, but it's after the fact. And it's very difficult then to have ELL issues addressed in a comprehensive fashion where there's a shared responsibility for making sure that whatever might be the district-wide program is implemented with fidelity for English language learners as well. In some cases, the ELL office might be brought in at a later time to make some modifications and adjustments, but in other cases they might not, and then it is just really left up to English language learner teachers particular principals that are knowledgeable of this area, or simply the ELL office that tries to come up with their own modifications to assist English language learners, and teachers that are trying to implement a program that was adopted district-wide but really didn't have a concerted process to address EL issues. In terms of instructional issues that are specific to literacy and instruction for English language learners, one of the things that we have found is the access to research, access to the type of information that we heard from Diane. For our districts, sometimes it's a matter of the timing in terms of they are administering programs, and they typically don't have the luxury of having that time to really sift through a lot of critical research to then incorporate into their programs. And to the extent that they rely on some type of research documents or secondhand reviews of research, whether it be done through, the commercial providers or even, some of their professional magazines that are put out there, it is very difficult for them to really incorporate the more critical elements that are supported by research into the programs. I want to move on to just say, having said all this, and the next slide might be, I want to get into the Council's implementation very quickly, just to show you, and this will be something you can go back to because I know that this next slide is very difficult to read. But I pulled out a couple of examples of what we need to do for the implementation of the Common Core, because I want to close with that, is having said that in terms of what the challenges are with improving literacy and in our own districts with regard to systemic issues, we know that we have a lot of work to do, and these are just 3 examples of what we need to happen at the district level for the Common Core. What we're hoping to see is that these systemic responses to implementing Common Core are going to incorporate, not as an afterthought, but integrally at the outset, issues regarding English language learners. The Council is working on pulling together some folks to actually help districts do this, because we recognize that not all districts have the capacity to do it in their own district. And so, for example, the first one, we're looking at having to revise curriculum for special populations and make sure that there's English language development that's aligned with the standards. There are issues around instruction. If we're seeing a shift in instruction, what will that look like for English language learners? We need to help principals and administrators and districts be able to recognize whether or not that shift is occurring for English language learners, not only general ed, kids that are in general ed. Finally, the third point here is designing and vetting criteria for examining student work. And this goes to examples of different levels of proficiency in English. What does the work look like so that we know that we actually have to train teachers to recognize and be able to assess, okay, the child is mastering the standard and the content. However, the child is at a different level of proficiency in English, and that's a valid observation, but to not confuse one for the other. And that's pretty much just an example of the things that we have to do, and it might seem daunting, but I think for us it's just making it clear that we really need to work together to move English language learners to the point where they can perform to the Common Core standards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. We have lots of questions here, so I'm going to get started right away. We have some 50 questions or so have come in since we started the webinar. The first one I'd like you to address. Why don't each of you address this, but start us out, Diane. What do you consider to be the most critical reason so many English language learners struggle in so many of our schools?
Oh, that's a real easy question to answer. Well, I think actually I'd like to build on some of what Gabriela was saying, in that English language learners from the beginning need to be thought of at the beginning of any school improvement or district improvement or process or district instructional plan. And usually what happens is people pretend that the students in the district, in many districts, are native English speakers, and it's not the case. So I think if we could use universal design principles to think about when we develop instructional approaches or curriculum, that we really think about methods that are going to work for all children. And we're still not doing that. We're really not. We're just assuming that, we use the mainstream methods, we use the mainstream instructional strategies, and that's sufficient. And then ELs are always an afterthought. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to start with universal design principles and then, beyond that, think about what additional things we might do that are specific to ELs. And a lot of that, refers to some of the things I was talking about, especially building on these children's first knowledge language, their knowledge of first language, their literacy skills in their first language, the conceptual knowledge they have in their first language. So thinking of these children as bringing lots of assets to the classroom. So.
And what do you think, Gabriella?
I'd like to agree with Diane on that, and I think part of what makes it difficult is that it seems like we're speaking out of both sides of our mouth. We want it all to be all, but then we also want it different. And I think that's what a lot of the districts struggle with. To the extent they want to move forward with any particular initiative or curriculum or program, that's fine, and we want the same expectations for English language learners, but we also want the adjustment made. And depending on district to district, whether that means using native language instruction, doing dual language, or it means some other support that's provided, I think it has to be particular to the needs of ELs. And what we have found in the districts that we looked at were the ones where there was an explicit effort made to address ELL needs, not in a fragmented fashion, but that would feed in to the overall program with data. That's where we actually saw the improvement. So in places where we saw that ELLs were not doing that well, it tended to be much more fragmented. And so the short answer, I think, really is program delivery. It has to do how we are serving ELLs.
Can I just add one quick thing?
Sure.
I mean, I think that ideally this needs to happen at the district level so that whatever planning takes place, as Gabby says, is not fragmented, it's comprehensive, it uses the data available. But also another issue that we have with English learners is that a lot of these children come from poverty backgrounds and they attend schools that are high poverty, and they also tend to be segregated in these schools. So to the extent, so there are factors that schools and districts are dealing with that are not, go beyond sort of instructional methods and approaches.
Right.
The best way for children to really acquire a second language is through interacting with native speakers in English, and these children tend to be very segregated in schools with, other children who are also limited English proficient from the same language background. They just don't have these opportunities. And then, of course, all the factors that we have to deal with where these children are in districts where many other children are high poverty. So there's just a lot of factors that need to be considered in trying to, meet the educational needs of these children.
Okay, the next question actually kind of relates to this. How do you get administrators on board? Gabriella, you want to take that one?
With great difficulty sometimes. I think it's a combination. It's a recipe in the sense that you have to do it with support. There has to be accountability, but there has to be support. Administrators have lived through a number of initiatives and programs and the latest, fad. And then in our districts, the superintendents last around 3 to 5 years. And as superintendents come in, they bring with them different ideas and different approaches. So I think part of it is to have administrators feel that they're being supported with relevant instructional programs, professional development, and time. And then also with accountability systems that don't create perverse incentives, as we currently do under NCLB. We have an LEP subgroup that by definition is limited in their English proficiency, and therefore it's every time they become proficient, they leave the group. And so I think it's a combination of making sure that they feel supported. They're going to be held accountable, but when they are not delivering on achievement, they need to be supported and be clear about where they need to go with students.
Okay. And we have a lot of questions here just on nuts and bolts. And we, Diane, you talked about the importance of oral language.
Yeah.
And we have a question here about how are we going to get more of that in our schools, the teaching of oral language?
That's a really good question. I think starting with institutions that train teachers probably to provide coursework and practice in helping teachers take standard curriculum and, as Gabby said, adapting it to include more oral language. So a lot of what we do, for example, with basal readers or standard curriculum is that we do a lot of interactive oral reading. So you have to teach teachers how to do this, where you can read aloud chunks of the text to students that are not reading that text at grade level to give them more opportunities to develop their oral language proficiency, but also as a way to give them access to grade level content.
Okay. And I noticed I had a number of questions just about how can some of this happen when you have English language learners mixed with non-English language learners in a class. And that's something you were recommending, Diane. So whether you're talking about oral language development or teaching vocabulary, how does this work when you have the students in the same class?
Well, I'm doing a lot of work in integrated classrooms. Integrated, by that I mean classrooms that include English language learners and English proficient students. And again, we start with the principle that we're trying to give all children in that classroom access to the grade-appropriate content. And we build in methods to scaffold instruction for the EL. So you all saw some of the visuals that we use where we, instead of just having kids define words, we show them pictures that exemplify the words. And when we have partner talk where you can pair English proficient children with children who are less proficient and interact around, applying that concept to find your background knowledge to that concept. So, for example, so those are just some examples, but you can also differentiate instruction. So in those classrooms, teachers can pull aside a small group of children and work with them. Doing interactive reading, say you have kids that really cannot read at grade level, the teacher can work with a small group and meanwhile can have the other children work in pairs and read the passage on their own and answer questions as they go. So there are lots of ways to provide direct teacher instruction to the whole class as well as to differentiate activities within the class.
And also just, if I can add something.
Sure.
In terms of the districts that we represent, we have almost 24% of the nation's children that are eligible for free lunch. And so also what we have are students that are coming from homes that have low levels of literacy, even, from their family members. And so in some instances, you actually have monolingual English-speaking children in a class with English learners, but they actually are benefiting from that scaffolded approach to acquiring English and then also developing literacy. And I think this is where those strategies and just the whole concept and allowing for time for that development is helpful. I think the having those classrooms where you have a mixed population poses a lot of opportunities for learning the kids one from another. However, I must say that when we're in districts, it is a question that we get asked a lot, very much so in terms of how do you support a classroom like that. In terms of professional development, I think the instructional strategies and the supports that teachers get with those classes are great. However, then all of a sudden you have a variety of interventions, and it becomes very difficult for the teacher to manage the various interventions that some of those children are participating in.
Okay, so this makes me wonder what you think
programs.
about the newcomer programs and having students separated.
I think, part of it is it varies across the country, though. I mean, sometimes the kids are in there for a year, sometimes a year or two, a year and a half. It varies. I think there is. I think the jury is still out on that one in terms of where people find themselves. I don't think it's necessarily consensus. And in fact, districts have sort of gone back and forth in terms of how they support and what the timeline looks like for these programs. But having said that, I do think that there are some very real needs that newcomer students need to have met before they are transitioned into either your regular English language learner program or not. And I think, like any other program, it really just needs to be monitored very closely, both in terms of development of English but also content. And then for them, it's just the acculturation to the district, including serving the families, and making that. Where I've seen that it is more successful than not is where it is not perceived as this, separate camp or, hallway where all those kids are warehoused, but rather where there's very strong family involvement, community involvement, support of those groups of students as they make their way into the other schools.
So, Marianne, can I just add that I think
Sure.
in some cases it's a really good idea, but I think the programs need to concentrate more than on just foundational levels of English. So they need, from the beginning, try to give kids access to grade appropriate content as the kids are acquiring foundational English. And so, anyway.
Okay. Well, we really only have time for about one more question. Just one question. And I got quite a few about long-term English language learners. So if, teachers don't have good professional development, or these students are falling through the cracks and they're in middle school and high school and they still haven't met district criteria for being fluent in English, what should school districts be doing then?
Well, I think an important thing is so we're going to assume that all of a sudden you've got these long-term ELs. I think it's important to try to figure out for each student exactly what their issues are, because they're probably going to differ. So some children may be long-term ELs because they haven't acquired the requisite knowledge in their first language. Other children may never have some, learning disabilities that need to be addressed that never were addressed. So perhaps they haven't learned to read fluently, or to read with accuracy and fluency. So I think it's important to look at why these children are long-term ELs to start with, and then to look at what resources the school has and try to match the children's needs with the resources that are available. It's not a homogeneous group of children.
So you're saying you can't just take a class and say, okay, this is going to be the class for long-term ELs.
Yeah.
That's right, exactly.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
And I think also what's important from what Diane said, and I would echo, is that you do it in a preventive manner. They don't become long-term ELLs all of a sudden. I mean, that clearly happened over a course of several years. Well, what were the things happening along those years that maybe, if you had caught it 3 years earlier, the student wouldn't actually end up in that long-term ELL group?
Yeah, and I just want to say that I suspect one of the reasons we do have long-term ELs is there's such a focus with these children in making them English proficient or teaching them strategies and not focusing on actually giving them access, to the knowledge they need to build background knowledge so that they understand text.
And, you know, Diane, an example of that is, for example, when you have programs that are really strong literacy programs and they help students with the mechanics and the skills, the discrete skills around reading, and they do well, let's say, up to third grade. And then all of a sudden, and when you see a lot of ELLs that are moving from below basic to basic and even to proficient, but then when you look at the entire distribution of ELLs across the whole range of proficiency, they're not moving into the advanced. And I think that's where districts can take a hard look. It's like, yeah, you might be meeting your AYP, but is that good enough? Are you meeting it just by getting them over the bubble, or are you meeting it by actually getting them into the more advanced levels where they have a better command of the meaning and of the language so that when they go into the higher level classes and grade levels, they don't become one of the long-term ELLs.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also really important to remember there are no silver bullets with this population. Right. I mean, people are looking for silver bullets. Can we do this program or that program or this strategy? And that's not going to be the answer. We need to take a very systematic approach and sort of stay with it, constantly monitoring the progress that these children make and looking at the particular needs of individual students.
I think with the Common Core standards, I mean, some of us are hoping that, you know, that school districts won't make some of the same mistakes they made in the past. So I'm just wondering, Gabriela, can you give us a bit of an update to wrap up here on where do the Common Core standards stand as far as looking at the needs of English language learners? I mean, is there anything going on to create English language proficiency standards to align with the academic standards, or where do things stand right now?
Well, I think, and Diane definitely can speak to this as well, but I think that, you know, in the development of the standards, everybody said, okay, we're not going to deal with it here, we're going to deal with it in implementation. Fine. Now we're at implementation stage, and we're going, okay, what do we do now? And fortunately, I think there has been a number of people in the field that have been mobilized into doing something. I think that's a positive. I must say that from the district's perspective, and it's maybe not a negative, but it is a little bit of a question mark, is, okay, of all the things that now we're hearing are starting to develop, what do we do? Which one do we use? As you know, the Department of Ed has their Enhanced Assessment Grant out there for developing English language proficiency assessments that obviously would have to be built on some set of standards. But there's also other efforts that we've been in conversations with folks where they're looking at developing some type of English language proficiency. I don't know if they're standards. Diane, would you call them expectations? I'm not sure what to call them. But they're more related to the Common Core and specifically to academic language or academic English. I know from the council's perspective, what we realize is our districts are moving so quickly that we're very worried that they won't wait for these other standards to be developed, and they're just going to use whatever they have in their state, and they are just going to move like what has happened before, you know, in a systematic fashion that doesn't necessarily incorporate ELLs. So we are actually looking at working with some of the experts to help our districts make sure that they incorporate the issues. While they have to abide by whatever their state is doing with regard to English language proficiency standards, we could build in other things so that they go beyond those that they have to abide by law. So I think there are many things out there. Districts are moving very quickly. Some states are already starting to develop item banks for assessments, and I am pretty sure they are not necessarily including ELLs. So we're a little bit in the same situation that we are in many instances where we're having to find the key points to insert ourselves to really address ELL issues.
Diane, a few words on common standards?
Well, I think it's going to be very important for districts to look at right now to develop protocols to look at how well students with different levels of English proficiency sort of function in terms of meeting the particular Common Core standards, because I think that will give them insight into understanding what the academic language needs of these children are, and moving from there to trying to figure out, given the kinds of curriculum and methods they're using, what do they need to do additionally to help children meet these standards. And then, of course, developing formative assessments that can be used to assess how well children are doing in meeting the standards, and these formative assessments ideally would be used to guide instruction. There's a lot of work to be done.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so at this point we're going to turn to our sponsor for a couple more minutes.
This year, more than 5 million English learners are attending school in the United States. By 4th grade, only a third of them will be reading at a basic level, which means that 2/3 of these students are less likely to graduate from high school, go to college, and get jobs. But that doesn't have to happen. This is Chula Vista. It serves nearly 10,000 English learners every year. In 2006, 2 schools in Chula Vista started using Imagine Learning English, a language and literacy software program designed to help English learners improve their reading and speaking skills. The program was cost-effective, and it offered unique features just for English learners, like first language support, reading comprehension instruction, and oral language development. Imagine Learning English was like having an expertly trained tutor for each student, providing one-on-one instruction and unique learning paths for every child, all the while reinforcing everything taught in the classroom. In 2010, beginning English learners who used Imagine Learning English jumped an average of 37 points on the State Language Arts Test and 104 points on the State English Development Test. And 43 of the 44 schools in the district were using the program. The students' reading and speaking skills got better and better, as did their chances of graduating from high school, going on to college, and having brighter futures. 8 of the 10 largest school districts in the country are giving their English learners a brighter future by giving them Imagine Learning English. And they're giving their struggling readers, early childhood education students, and students with disabilities the same opportunity. At Imagine Learning, we are committed to working with schools and teachers
learning, and I learned some words, math, and games. That's what I learned when I came to America. I moved here 4 months ago from Brazil. It's important to be smart, to get a good job. It's important because I could have a better job and I could help my family by making them proud of me.
You can win it and you can lose it, and that's your choice. I just decided to win it.
Thank you, and that's all we have time for this afternoon. I want to give a big thank you to Diane and Gabriella for their presentations, and thank you to those of you who tuned in. As I mentioned, there will be an archive of today's discussion and the PowerPoint slides available at our website. That's www.edweek.com. Thank you and goodbye.